to the Answer Garage. Today we're going to be discussing heavy-duty ride control and specifically looking at how to test for worn shock absorbers. Now, we know that for the most part, if you look at a tire and there's wear on the tire, that may be one indicator. But what if there's no wear on the tire?
Absolutely. There are three ways of telling if a shock is bad by looking at the shock itself. Number one, is the shock leaking oil? Number two, is there mount damage? Anything physically wrong with the end mounts? Number three is something we'll spend more time discussing, but that is if something has damaged the shock internally that may not be visible to the eye.
Looking firstly at oil, leaking oil, for the most part, you will see some oil on a shock absorber, and that's a natural occurrence, right?
Yes, what you're referring to is what we call as a misting phenomenon. It's something that's very normal in a shock when it's going through its standard process. What we want to talk about as far as something that's actually wrong with the shock, something that perhaps has compromised the oil seal, is leaking shock and leaking oil from that shock. And that would look like to the tech or the owner-operator, streaks of oil, no pattern, sort of a randomness flowing down the outside of the tube. That's a very visual, very easy to spot way of leaking. So when you look at the I-ring, there's a number of ways that a mount can get damaged. Number one, this inner steel sleeve can actually get elongated, severe application. Number two, perhaps the bushing, the rubber itself around that sleeve can get worn out and damaged. Number three, which is a more severe event, the I-ring itself can get damaged. It can either get elongated like the sleeve that I mentioned, or it can actually get torn right away from the shock absorber itself.
So those first two things are very visual. What if there are no indicators that you can see? How do you test then?
That's a real good point, because the third one that we discussed in a little more detail now is what I consider, because of that, probably the most dangerous one, because you can't see it. You can have a shock that appears just like this, where you have some internal damage to that shock that results in this third type of failure. And how we accomplish that is by using the heat check method. Since shocks generate heat when working, you can compare the temperature of the shocks one to another to get an idea of the working condition of the shock. To do the heat test, the truck or trailer suspension should have been working for a minimum of 15 minutes and then tested within 5 minutes of stopping. So let's discuss how you do this heat test. First of all, here's your heat gun. You take your heat gun and briefly touch the outside of the shock and then compare it to another shock on the same side of the vehicle. They should be about the same warm temperature. Suspect a failure if any shock is noticeably colder than the other shocks on the vehicle. Now, I'd like to remind you though, please be careful, because shocks can generate a lot of heat. That's why I say briefly touch the shock.
Well, it sounds like anybody could do it. It's pretty simple.
That's the beauty of the test. It's extremely simple. Anybody can do it.
Now, how often should you be doing this test?
That depends. It depends upon how old the vehicle is, which obviously will translate to how old the shock is. But if you were to make this test once a month, I would think that would be adequate.
Okay, and maybe more frequently as the vehicle gets older?
Absolutely. The older a vehicle gets, obviously the shock's going to get more worn and need to be tested more often.
One other thing I wanted to ask was, when you're warming the shock up, how far should you be driving it in order to get it warm enough to test?
The owner-operator is probably the best person that can do this. He's with his vehicle all day. When he would pull into a rest stop or an area, the first thing he can do when he exits the vehicle is go do the heat check right then. Shock's going to be coming off the road. It's going to be working. If it's going to be warm, it's going to be warm then. Another time when the test can be taken is when if the vehicle is going into the garage for service, that service underwriter, when he comes up to check the vehicle, one of the first things he should check is this. Because after about 15 or 20 minutes, a shock is going to gradually cool down and lose the effectiveness of that test.
In looking at a shock absorber from the outside, you don't really see a lot of what's going on inside that generates this kind of heat. You take us through what is going on inside.
That's a real good point. The outer appearance of a shock is, just as you said, pretty simple. What's going on inside to generate that control force, to generate that heat. So let's study that right now. If you look at the inside of a shock, this is what's known as a twin tube shock. It consists of an outer tube and an inner tube. This inner tube is completely full of oil. So in the truck, or in this case, when someone's manually taking that shock and compressing it and extending it, this piston assembly is being driven through that oil. That's how a shock gets its control force. On that piston assembly, you'll notice there's a piston ring, split ring right around the piston. That ring's purpose is to make sure that the oil flows through the piston assembly. It flows through the holes, through the springs, and through the disc. Let's go back to Hydraulics 101. Oil wants to seek out the path of least resistance. Because of this ring, it's flowing through that piston. Let's fast forward 2, 3, 4 million cycles of this shock stroking up and down over the next couple of years. When that ring wears out, the oil then has found its path of least resistance, and that's around the piston. When the oil flow is flowing around the piston, it's not producing control force, and therefore it's not producing heat. You can't tell from looking at that shock that that ring is worn out. That's why we depend entirely on that heat check method. When it doesn't generate heat, that means you probably have a failure right here at this O-ring. So if it's cold, it's old. If it's warm, it's working.